morning. This is Senator Dick Black. We're at Focus on the News, August 26th. And today we're going to be talking about the Kursk offensive. But first, just a quick note. There has been a stabbing attack at a diversity festival in Germany. Celebrating diversity as our strength, with the attack of Germans by a knifer who was associated with the Islamic State, and I'm not sure whether they have actually captured the individual yet or not. They were celebrating the 650th anniversary of the city of Solingen in Germany. And here the city has lasted through 650 years of war and peace, and now that the globalists have decided to push mass migration on all Western civilizations, there are insane people running around with knives, slashing and killing German citizens at will. This is not the first. 2021, there was a Somali national armed with a kitchen knife who killed 3 people in Würzburg. And just in June 24, an Afghan asylum seeker attacked people in Mannheim. He knifed 6 people, including a police officer who died of his stab wounds. Now, clearly, if the people of these various countries, whether it's the United States or Germany or Sweden, if they were self-governing in any true sense, they'd never accept having these people. What are Somalis doing in Germany? Somalis weren't in Germany for thousands and thousands of years. Suddenly, the globalists, the boys from Davos, the World Economic Forum, all of these internationalist globalists have decided, well, we're going to flood the world. We're going to break up the unity of all the sovereign peoples, and we'll unleash these people, and they can kill and maim, spread drugs and all sorts of things. And it'll make it easier for us, the globalists, to control the globe. And they have done it with enormous intensity and impact. And so it's just a reminder that while we fool ourselves about being self-governing, government of, by, and for the people, this isn't what the people want. But the people will accept whatever they're told to accept and like it, or suffer the consequences. So today we're going to talk about the Kursk offensive. We have the situation where the Russian forces were advancing at a steady and somewhat rapid pace on the advance towards the logistical hub of Pokrovsk, and then the decision was made, apparently by NATO nations in conjunction with Zelensky, to launch a fairly major attack on the Kursk Oblast, which was quite a ways north of where fighting had been going on. And in any event, we're going to talk about that today with Jim Jatras, who is truly an expert on Russia and the Ukraine war and all of these things. So Jim, welcome. We're always pleased to have you with us, and this is a very intense time in the Russian Ukrainian conflict, and we're very interested in your thoughts on it.
Thank you, Senator. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be with you. If I could first give you just a little footnote on your opening statement regarding these attacks. Let's not forget the one that occurred in Britain just a few weeks ago. 3 little girls stabbed to death. And then when people protested, the authorities came down on them like a ton of bricks in the way they never do with left-wing or anti-Christian, anti-European rioters in these countries, and I think you're right. There are 2 aspects to this. This is a deliberate policy by whoever we want to say, the globalists, or whatever, the World Economic Forum, but also the complicit governments in virtually all countries that have a European, aka white Christian history, to dilute and destroy their national character and identity and replace it with a kind of mob of competing social groups that can be controlled. And we don't really see this they're not doing this to Asian countries or African countries or Latin American countries, only historically European Christian countries. And I think that tells us something. And the flip side of that is how docile the populations of these countries are, that they watch this happening to them in broad daylight and through some sense of misplaced altruism, like, oh, we need to be compassionate about people who are unfortunate, or even more so, the terror of being accused of racism or Islamophobia or whatever it might be. They just sit there and watch this happen, watching children being killed, or as we've seen in England, prostituted by criminal gangs. And they shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, but let's not forget the real danger is from the far right thugs. You really do wonder at what point people will just say enough is enough. We're not putting up this with anymore. Unfortunately, the electoral mechanisms for replacing these people don't seem to be functioning. We saw how they rigged the elections in England and in France, and of course, Germany is a kind of a lost cause, it seems. And frankly, I don't know how much hope we hold out for what's going to happen in this country in November. So I'm glad you brought this to people's attention. To Kursk, who is the Civil War general said, hit them where they ain't. And that's, I think, what the Ukrainians have done here, clearly with the guidance and complicity of Western governments, certainly our government, also the British, certainly, to try to bring the war to the Russians on their own territory, with the idea, I guess, they would put themselves in a better bargaining position, or maybe destabilize things in Russia that would benefit them. But what we're really seeing, if you look at it, is what amounts to a NATO invasion of Russian territory, of undisputed pre-1991 Russian territory. And I look, to what extent, I hate to say this, I think the Russians have brought this on themselves by being so restrained and responsible in how they prosecute this conflict, expecting at some point somebody's going to negotiate with them. And I don't know what it takes over there for them to figure out that that's not going to happen. That we've got, just like we were talking about on the migration front, we've got irresponsible, let's face it, criminal leadership in charge of these Western countries that is willing to risk World War III to try to preserve some sort of dominance in Europe by somehow winning the war in Ukraine, or if they can't do that, at least continuing to hurt the Russians. And I think that's what's going on here. So now the real question is not only how the Russians will wrap up this Kursk incursion, and I think that my guess is they will probably take their time doing that, because it appears that the Ukrainians are still sucking out forces from the front in Donbass, which they could ill afford to lose, and throwing them into the cauldron, into Kursk, to try to maintain that salient there. And maybe the Russians figure for the short term, that's in their interests. Let them send more troops, more material in there that will then be destroyed. But, the attrition in this war is just horrible. What it's doing to the people of Ukraine is just horrible. And the fact that Zelensky and his regime in Kiev are willing to do this at the behest of their Western masters just speaks volumes.
I think about something that you brought up in an earlier show that we did, where you questioned, we were talking about whether Trump would be able to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. Mm-hmm. there's a little bit of hyperbole there, but not a lot. And you had said that you weren't sure that he would have that opportunity, that the war might end with a Ukrainian collapse, I think, prior to that time. And or not to put words into your mouth, but that general notion. And I thought that was enlightening. But I think what we see here, in addition to the principal objective, the principal objective of the Kursk attack was to draw Russian troops from the main effort at Petrovsk. It was very clear. And we saw a continuation of this old pattern that NATO advisors are constantly pushing this notion that that somehow President Putin will panic. If we do this, he'll panic. If we do that, he'll panic. And he will make some erratic move that will be counterproductive for Moscow. And I think that was one of the suppositions here is we're going to launch this attack. We're going to take this enormous risk of withdrawing elite forces from the front lines around Petrovsk, and we'll send them up north to attack a rural agricultural area of no military significance whatsoever. And that will panic President Putin. He'll go crazy. He'll start biting the rug and the other things that they used to propagandize about Hitler. And then he'll do something bizarre. He'll yank off all of his troops from Petrovsk, and he'll throw the whole war into disarray. As we've seen repeatedly throughout this war, President Putin is a very steady hand at the tiller. He does not lose focus on the direction the ship is headed. He takes note. There's political implications when you have an attack on Russian soil, but he is a very stoic individual. He's not a person given to emotional outbursts or emotional reactions. And I see little evidence that he has been moved by this Kursk incursion in any significant way. He's obviously got to tend to the political consequences of having forces, but the Ukrainians managed. They put about 5,000 of their most elite battle-hardened troops into attacking the almost insignificant forces that were defending Kursk. You had young conscripts who had no experience, no organization, and you had police and people like that. It was basically, very thinly defended. So you have all these elite troops come bursting across the border. Obviously, you're going to, I would surrender, and I was prepared. I was not going to surrender under any circumstances. But and this is when I fought in Vietnam, and I was prepared to make the last radio call, one that would call in napalm on my own position. And my feeling is, if they're going to overrun us, by gosh, they're going to burn together. And but at the same time, there's a certain point at which it's just simply suicide to continue, and it serves no purpose. So certainly there have been surrenders there, but even if they've captured about 400 square miles in Kursk. What if they manage to capture 1,000? They more than doubled it. So what? you capture a bunch of farmland, which has no military significance whatever, and at the same time you're drawing from the main battle of Pokrovsk.
That's right. One of the main concerns we should have too, by the way, Senator, is that there's strong evidence of a lot of foreigners in these forces that win the Kursk. Poles, obviously, but also it appears Americans, British, French, others. So that when the Russian and again, I assume that these are either CIA or intelligence people, or if maybe they're private military contractors, or maybe they're people who are from the active armed forces of NATO countries but have been seconded to the Ukrainians, are not technically U.S. or British personnel right now. We don't really know. But again, this is one of the worries I do have here. I'm certainly not arguing that anybody in Moscow should react blindly or emotionally to anything that's going on. But sometimes I get the sense with the Russians that this kind of steady, stick to the plan approach doesn't fully take into account the kind of nutcases they're dealing with in the West that will respond with provocations that don't seem rational from a strategic point of view, but do bring us closer and closer to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, which could escalate out of control. And it seems to me they're not fully cognizant of that danger when they sort of stick to their tut-tut, we're going to stick to the plan and not be rattled by anything the other side does. They should be a little bit rattled that they're dealing with the likes of, Anthony Blinken over here on this side, and that there's no telling what kind of irresponsible, dangerous things these people will do if this is drawn out much further. Another thing, just another footnote I'd like to add is that, supposedly this is all, so we can support democracy in Ukraine. I'm sure you've seen the news that the government in Kiev, the regime in Kiev, is about to prohibit the largest Christian body in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is the church of about 70% of the population, because they say it's falsely that it's a Russian affiliated church. Again, and then this has gotten almost no news in the Western media, that we're still being fed this line. This is all about democracy, autocracy, really the same sort of line we're getting in our domestic context. If you watched Kamala Harris's acceptance speech at the convention there, versus the maniacal damning of Trump as an autocrat and friend of Putin and Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and all those people like that. So we're living in this very, very dangerous moment, Senator. And I'm a little bit pessimistic about the future, that one way or another we're looking at some very, very rough riding in the months ahead.
Well, I would agree with that overall assessment too. It is interesting that, we created this illusion that Ukraine is a democratic country, and yet here we have a non-Christian leader, Zelensky, basically destroying the church that services 70% of the population of Ukraine. And you have Zelensky, a non-Christian leader, simply deciding, I don't like the date when Christmas is celebrated, and so I'm going to change it because I want to be more modernized. I want to be more like the West. The church had no voice in this. Zelensky dictated it. And apparently there is some resistance. I read that there was actually, they reported it as hundreds, but they showed the photos, and it was obviously many thousands of people who were making a pilgrimage to one of the most revered sites in Ukraine. And they were not allowed to do this under Zelensky's decree. And so they just marched forward. Now, there was one village that ordered them stopped, and they had to go around, and the mayor, or whatever he is, essentially the mayor of the village, said, "I don't have a problem with God. My problem is with the Ukrainian, with the church."
Mhm.
And well, that's nice of him to say that he's willing to accept God. That he's not simply resisting God. That's very kind of
Very
him. He's
charitable,
very
yes.
generous. He's being charitable to God. He's not deciding to bring his fist down on God's head. Uh, but you can sense the contemptuousness of these elites who they hate the people that they rule.
Mhm.
Uh, all the European Union. The European Union is an absolute dictatorship. There's nothing democratic about it. The European Commission that stands at the pinnacle of it
Mhm.
is unelected.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of unelected bureaucrats. And the European Parliament, which is elected, is not able to introduce legislation.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
that they can do is listen to what the dictators say and tinker around the edges with it. It's a big facade. It's just an absolute hoax on the people of Europe.
Well, it's about as democratic, both in Ukraine and at the EU SSR, as the process that in our country, where the party that calls itself Democratic removed in a palace coup the sitting president, who was in fact nominated by voters of his own party, and then selected somebody who has not received a single vote from anybody in a primary to now make her the Democratic candidate for president in our democracy. It's just utterly bizarre, but
It is.
that's the level we've reached.
It is. Just to touch on that a second, it is my impression, and I don't tend to be, just critical of individuals when I don't have to be, but I've listened to statements by Kamala Harris over the years that they've had the presidency, the Democrats have. It is my impression that this is a woman of extraordinarily low IQ. She cannot put together a coherent paragraph. She just babbles like, that a school child would say, what are you talking about, lady? You're not making any sense to me. So here was a woman who was so unpopular within her own party
Mm-hmm.
that she couldn't get a single vote, and she was the first, I think, to drop out of this primary slate, and she was widely condemned within the liberal media as being, this is kind of an inconsequential nincompoop. Nobody could possibly go for her. But then they kind of narrowed down their options and said, well, it's very difficult for us to move
Mm-hmm.
the campaign funds from Biden to some other person. And so it just sort of got to the point where it's a dollars and cents thing. Kamala's going to be the one. And this is a woman, I mean, it's just astounding in a country of almost, a third of a billion people like the United States is, that the person who emerges at the top is someone who cannot construct a coherent paragraph. And she takes the place of a man who is obviously mentally incapacitated, who's walking around shaking hands with the air and walking into the bushes. I mean, what a choice. You go from one to the other. Here we are, we have these people who they really, in a sense, they're almost imaginary figures who prop up this institution of people who are not elected and who are simply there to dictate to the American people, not to listen to what they are concerned about, but to tell them what they're going to believe and what they're not going to believe.
Yeah, yeah, and the sad thing, Senator, is it might work. I mean, the fact that very few Americans probably know much about Kamala Harris one way or the other. The media, they can package her as this, this, first that. It's all about joy and happiness and whatever nonsense that they're peddling these days against that mean old orange man, and try to make it a referendum on Trump and just hope that she can then do what Joe Biden did in 2020 as the non-Trump. I mean, she didn't have to be anything in her own right. She has to just be the not Trump. And especially since, as far as I can tell, virtually none of the electoral abuses that occurred in 2020 and also in the congressional elections of 2022 have been corrected in terms of drop-off ballots and ballot harvesting and all of this nonsense. And also the fact, let's face it, we've got 4 more years of demographic change that's occurred in this country in the last during Joe Biden's time in office, and goodness knows how many aliens, non-citizens, both legal and also illegal. People forget it's not just voting by illegal aliens that's against the law. It's also voting by legal aliens who are not yet naturalized, who are not yet citizens. And of course, we don't, even in places where they have voter ID, which is precious few places, they don't have proof of citizenship that needs to be presented at the time of registration. You just check a box saying I'm a U.S. citizen, and very, very little effort is made to actually checking to see if those certifications are correct. So, I think people justly have very, very little confidence in our elections, and this whole song and dance scam may actually work in this election, despite, for example, the defection of Bobby Kennedy to the Trump camp. So again, it's going to be very, very interesting what happens this fall.
I do think that that the defection of Robert Kennedy Jr. Or anyway, RFK Jr.
RFK.
I think that's a real net gain for Trump. There had been this discussion, well, maybe he would draw from the Democrats, but his strength stems in large part from the peace movement in the United States, which is almost uniformly Republican at this point. It's not that there aren't an abundant number of warmongers, particularly in Congress and in the Senate and also in the House, just to a lesser extent. But to the extent that there is a genuine peace movement in the United States, it is a Republican-leaning movement, and the Democrats, to them, peace is a big deal, but only when it benefits you politically. Peace, for its own purposes, is meaningless because they simply don't place the same value on human life as many of their opponents do. But I did want to sort of give a little bit of an update on what's going on with the Kursk battle. I've tried to get something that gives literally the up to the hour progress of the Russian army, but because the Ukrainians have withdrawn so many top flight troops and sent them up to Kursk, it has weakened the lines defending Pokrovsk, and the Russian army is proceeding pretty rapidly now towards that logistical hub. And the nearest I can tell is that several days ago they were within 5 miles. And I've seen that confirmed in a couple of different places. So I think the 5 miles is very reliable, but they may be closer by this time. And I just can't get anything more recent than 2 or 3 days back. But the effective range of ordinary Russian artillery is something around 10 miles. This is not the real high-powered stuff, not the most modern stuff, just sort of the old-fashioned Soviet era artillery. Gives you about 10 miles. They're within 5 miles, so they're within very easy, effective artillery range of the city of Pokrovsk, and advancing rapidly. There's setting in a degree of panic now among the residents of Pokrovsk, who are struggling with, what do we do? Obviously it's very painful. People are leaving homes and deciding where do we go from here? We don't have any other place. It's a very sad situation, but I think now Pokrovsk is a large area. It's a city that originally had about 70,000 inhabitants. So it's a very large urban place, and a place that will have a lot of hiding places for defenders. So that likely will mean that Pokrovsk will be blown to smithereens under, in coming times. At some point, I think it is likely that there's going to be a collapse in the lines at some point. To some degree, this advance on Pokrovsk is a manifestation of this collapse. It's not a collapse at this point. It's just a sort of a tremor, a shaking in the lines. But the lines are falling back. They're falling back rather quickly. The Russian troops are advancing, and they're advancing with increasing rapidity. Meanwhile, in Kursk, they've effectively reached the culminating point. Now, in military parlance, the culminating point is the point at which an attack has become so attenuated from its base of support and has so exhausted its forces by expanding its zone of control that it loses its punch, its forward punch, and at that point it becomes very vulnerable to counterattack. Now, I don't think the Russians are going to think about shifting forces up there. I think they're going to let the people they've managed to accumulate. They brought up some experienced people from down in the area around Kherson, some of those places around the Black Sea area. They moved some of those north, and those are veterans. And then they've moved additional just raw manpower. But I think the Russians are quite satisfied to let those troops gain experience and tie down the Ukrainians, while the real force of this attack towards Pokrovsk continues and in fact doubles down.
Yeah, that sounds right. As far as Pokrovsk goes, as I understand it, that's a pretty big logistical hub in terms of the transportation networks. And if that comes under Russian control, it becomes very, very difficult for the Ukrainians then to supply other places on the front, places like Kramatorsk and other places that are really vital to holding the line by the Ukrainians. Look, I just hope this ends sooner rather than later, not only because of the human carnage, but just the potential for escalation. The longer this goes on, the greater the chances something really, really bad happens. And I don't think anybody wants that, or at least nobody sane wants that. What some of our leadership might want, I don't know. But I this is such a tragedy, and such a human tragedy. And at some point, if that collapse does occur, somebody in Moscow has got to have figured out what they want to see as an end state for this war? I mean, what is the future of the Ukrainian state, if any, or whether maybe a new replacement state for it? Because I don't see how there can be any kind of stable future when not only this regime continues with Zelensky, and now I believe also the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, has now exceeded its constitutional mandate, and there really is no legitimate government in Kiev anymore. It's at some point that they've got to figure out what they want out of all of this, rather than just sort of letting events take their course and see what happens.
Yeah. People forget that Zelensky is not an elected president any longer. He just decided he was going to cancel elections when his time ran out, and of course, NATO is saying, oh well, he couldn't possibly do an election during wartime. Well, Abraham Lincoln did an election during wartime. President Putin did an election in wartime. Bashar al-Assad did multiple elections in very desperate periods within Syria. So it is normal. It's the normal course of action that if you have a democratically elected president, whether it's a strong president as it is in some of these places, or one that's not quite as strong, the fact is the norm is to conduct elections in wartime. And the extraordinary deviation from that is where you have someone who simply emerges as a dictator from war. And I don't know that there's any reason to suspect that Zelensky will feel obliged to ever conduct an election in the future if somehow he were to survive the current attacks that are going on.
Yeah. It's well, I hope it's not catching. I just have this scenario in my mind that Joe Biden has a health crisis and then and has to resign from the presidency, and Kamala succeeds him in the Oval Office, and then maybe she could proclaim herself president on an extended term because of an emergency of some sort. So maybe the disease is catching. I don't know.
We'll have to see. Well, listen, Jim, this has been a good discussion. I appreciate you being on. I suspect there'll be lots more news from the battlefront and the political front. We're within, I think, 71 days of the election in the United States, and clearly, in addition to drawing troops away from the main battle at Petrovsk, the secondary objective was to keep the war alive until after November the 5th, so that the collapse does not occur during this Democratic administration.
Well, let's remember, too, that actually the election starts a lot sooner than that, with all the early voting that will happen in a lot of states. And let's never forget, the real crucial votes are the ones that come out of the boxes at 3 a.m. on election night in Philadelphia.
That's right. It comes down to the voters versus the unattended drop boxes, where people can surreptitiously deposit stacks and stacks of fake ballots, as they did in 2020. So
and in fact, it's nice that our country is so democratic. We don't even discriminate against voters on the basis of their body temperature.
Yes. I think it was it Bob Dole who retired and said, there was some famous politician who retired and said he was going to Chicago because when he died, he wanted to be able to continue voting.
Where is it? They call Election Day Resurrection Day someplace. I forget.
Resurrection Day. Okay, Jim. Well, listen, this has been Focus on the News with Senator Black and our guest, Jim Jatras. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next Monday.
Thank you.